For a long time, Christine Brown learned how to remain silent in a way that appeared to be strength. She smiled when she sensed things weren't equal. She laughed when romance hurt more than she cared to admit. She broke the silence when tension started to fill a room. And she continued on, not because it was easy, but because she knew that keeping it all together was what came with loving her family. Christine never had to be the loudest voice in the room. She did not tend to control the conversation. She didn't crave attention. Instead, she became the center of the emotional life. The one who remembered birthdays. The one who smoothed over conflicts. The one who made room for all the feelings that were supposed to matter to everyone else, even at the expense of her own. That position didn't come from weakness. It came from responsibility. Christine thought that by being nice enough, patient enough, flexible enough, things would balance themselves out. Because nobody's going to take care of your child better than. This, of course, would come back with interest if it were given freely. However, the price of responsibility when it is one-sided is a different matter. The audience has been watching Christine struggle to communicate what she is trying to accomplish. Not in dramatic confrontations, not with threats, not with ultimatums, but with honest conversation that came with real vulnerability. She spoke of wanting a connection, Langley, needing presence, desiring to be appreciated not only for the role but also as a partner. These weren't extravagant demands. These weren't unreasonable demands. Nonetheless, they were primal needs that centered on his emotions. And yet, again and again, these needs were considered optional. Christine, on the other hand, was recognized, then later ignored. Her sentiments were listened to, but rarely responded to. Her suffering was acknowledged, but never treated. And with that, over time, this phenomenon became hard to overlook. In what way was Christine's life complicated, apart from a lack of attention? It was the structure that surrounded it. An institution that demanded she exercised infinite patience. The structure that demanded infinite patience from endlessly understanding, endlessly accommodating. Christine had to learn to fit in, conform, and take the discomfort with a silent tongue. But initially, she accepted that. To be continued. She kept telling herself that this is what she signed up for with this family. This sacrifice is embodied in the foundation. This is the price one paid for membership. For a long while, she paid that price with no complaints. But endurance has its own limits. The years went by, but Christine began to realize a subtle but disturbing phenomenon. The amount of work she is putting is not being reciprocated. The toll it takes on her emotionally is not being shared. And the compromises she made were not being met halfway. Initially, she wondered whether she was asking for too much. She questioned herself. She minimized her own disappointment. Maybe, she thought, if she explained herself, things might change. Perhaps if she remained calm enough, gentle enough, things might get better. So she tried harder, and she lowered her standards. She used softer language. She waited. But waiting became a type of pain in itself. Every conversation that ended with no solution chipped away at something more. Not anger, not resentment, but trust. Christine knew that her feelings were significant. This trust gradually diminished. She started to see the distinction between being included versus being a priority, between being tolerated and being loved. And once a contrast is recognized, it cannot be overlooked. Christine observed how decisions were made, who they centered on, who they benefited, and who had to make adjustments subsequently. She realized that her own role is to stabilize, not to be substantive, to support, not to be supported. She did not figure significantly in the family situation. This woman was keeping it together from the outside. It didn't come with a sense of outrage either. It came with clarity. Christine began to see that the problem didn't lie with how she communicated. It wasn't that she wasn't clear. It wasn't that she was asking the question the wrong way. It was that her needs had never been central to the equation. She wasn't part of the priority system. She was part of the support system. And support systems are invisible until they fail. Christine saw herself in a different way after that. She started recognizing the amount of emotional labor she had normalized, the way she kept lowering her own expectations, the way she absorbed disappointment so that others might remain comfortable. She understood that she had been negotiating her worth all along without even realizing it. This realization made him nervous, because once you see the imbalance clearly, you can't go back. Christine didn't confront anyone directly. Indeed, she didn't storm out. She didn't issue ultimatums. Instead, she sat with the truth. Perhaps a better life lay somewhere, but he didn't know what. Despite common history, contrary to the version of the family she had once believed in, that inner struggle was far more burdensome than an argument could possibly be. She questioned herself extensively. Was she being selfish? Was she giving up too easily? Was she letting the family down by wanting more? Questions that remain are ones that linger longer than anyone watching can see. Christine wasn't afraid of sacrifice. She had proven that for years. What she feared most is that she might vanish within it. Slowly, secretly, she came to a painful realization. Such a love cannot thrive in an environment that lacks respect, that patience cannot repair what effort refuses to fix, and that keeping quiet doesn't protect the relationship. It simply postpones the truth.
Christine felt the full impact of that truth bearing in on her. She sensed the emotional distance increasing, not shrinking. The conversations echoing, never resolved. The promises remained theoretical rather than real. And for the first time, she allowed herself to ask a different question. Not, how do I fix this? But, why am I the only one trying? That single question changed everything. This is because it brought her flaws in less prominence while emphasizing the structure itself. Christine wasn't failing the system was failing her. She knew that real love, in its most healthy aspect, was not dependent on the constant destruction of the self. It doesn't require a person to reduce themselves so that others can feel comfortable. It doesn't promote silence over honesty. After which the realization dawned on him, and it could never be reversed. Before Christine finally revealed what everyone dreaded, she had already accepted the consequence of her own words. She knew that revealing the truth would ruin the tale, that it would make people uncomfortable, that it would bring forced confrontations to the surface. But she knew another thing. That is, continuing to remain silent would end up costing her far more than speaking ever would. Christine wasn't preparing for an argument. She was preparing for a conclusion. Then, before she could utter these words herself, she had to come to terms with what these meant. This is because lack of reciprocity in love leads to that endurance that lacks appreciation leads to erosion. So the idea of choosing yourself doesn't mean that you didn't care. It means that you finally do. That acceptance did not make her anger. It calmed her. It strengthened her. And this calmness is what paved the way for what happened afterward. Since now Christine stopped protecting the story, there was no need for the truth to be defended. And with this acceptance firmly in mind, she finally worked up the courage to speak the fateful words.
When Christine finally spoke, it didn't sound the way people expected it to. No shouting had occurred. No accusations thrown across the room. No dramatic moment devised to surprise. This was powerful because it was not furious. Christine, her voice didn't raise now because she wasn't trying to convince anyone anymore. She wasn't asking for understanding. She was not bargaining. She was stating a conclusion already reached. That's what made it unsettling. For years, Christine had tried to be the one explaining, soothing, translating her pain into language that would not upset anyone else. But not anymore. She wasn't filtering her truth through fear of conflict. She merely stated what she had come to accept. That she wasn't considered important anymore. That she felt no longer prioritized. That she could not stay in a relationship where her emotional needs were always put last. Those weren't dramatic words. They were devastating. For naming a thing that everybody felt but didn't want to utter. Christine didn't frame it as a failure of love. She framed it as a failure of structure. She did, however, recognize that the family was working in a way that was demanding endless accommodation from her, while others remained comfortable. That harmony had been sustained because of her yielding, not by the undertaking of both. Once she said that, there was no easy answer. You can argue with anger. You are able to let go of bitterness. But one can't argue with clarity. Christine didn't personally attack anybody in her words. They revealed a pattern. A pattern where her presence was expected in place, whereas her needs were optional. Where her contribution was expected, but her boundary requirements were inconvenient. And that pattern suddenly came into plain view. The reaction to her forthrightness spoke volumes more than anything an argument could have articulated. There was some discomfort, deflection, trying to reframe the issue, misunderstanding rather than imbalance. But Christine didn't engage in that back and forth. She was not attempting to rewrite history. She had been explaining why the future no longer could remain the same. Christine had always held on to the belief that with patience, a reward would come. That consistency would bring about connection. That loyalty would be given care in return. What she had come to see instead was that patience had become permission. She needs permission delayed indefinitely. Permission for emotional distance to become normal. Speaking aloud, Christine had broken the tacit agreement which had preserved the family relationship. The understanding that she would suffer in silence so others wouldn't have to make any changes. With that agreement broken, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Christine wasn't asking anybody to select her. She chose herself. That made a difference. She wasn't claiming priority. She was uncoupling herself from a system where priority was never given. That displacement changed the emotional geometry of the whole family.
Suddenly, Christine was not the stabilizer anymore. She was not the emotional buffer anymore. She was no longer sponging up tension to keep things running smoothly. And without that buffer, cracks began to appear. The conversations that followed were awkward. Not because they were not friendly, but because the roles that were familiar no longer applied. Christine wasn't begging. She wasn't compromising. She wasn't over-explaining. She was done performing emotional labor that went unseen. That quiet refusal was louder than a confrontation ever could have been. Christine's candor compelled a reckoning. It is not only the shock of her decision, but also from a long-held belief that she would always stay, that she would always adjust, that she would always make room. When that assumption collapsed, it left a vacuum, a space where accountability is supposed to be. Christine didn't fill that space with blame. She left it empty. And emptiness has a way of revealing what was missing all along. Her words did not accuse. They made it clear that she said that was not enough anymore. That effort counted. That presence mattered. That respect counted. And she admitted that those things were not being provided for her meaningfully. That changed how her departure was understood. This wasn't abandonment. Self-preservation it was. Christine was not refusing the family. She refused to make further sacrifices for the sake of their relationship. For the first time, she allowed herself to trust her experience without asking for any accreditation or confirmation. That was the moment everything changed, because once Christine stopped questioning her own reality, the narrative had no power over her anymore. She no longer needed agreement to go ahead. She didn't need permission to go out anymore. She had already reconciled herself to the fact. And that peace was unsettling to everyone else, because it meant she wasn't leaving in anger. She was leaving with a sense of certainty. Certainty doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't come back for closure. It moves itself forward. Christine's dispassionate acceptance compelled a recognition of reality that others had avoided. That her unhappiness was not sudden. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was the result of years of unmet needs finally being recognized by the person who mattered most. Herself. And once that was acknowledged, it could not be taken back. The system had lost its silent anchor. And without Christine holding it together, everything that followed would be exposed more lucidly than ever before. Following the speaking of truth by Christine, a shift in environment occurred, which cannot be ignored. Not because anyone challenged what she said, but because there was no one to fill the role she had been playing. For so many years, Christine has been the glue that has held the family together. The one who allowed difficult conversations. The one who diffused tension before it became conflict. The one who absorbed disappointments in silence so that others need not feel them. But when she stopped doing that, the silence weighed more. People started speaking with short sentences. The pauses continued for longer periods. And the lack of her emotional labor appeared for the first time. This is what people had not been expecting. Christine's leaving wasn't a physical departure only. It is a big change emotionally, which showed how important her balancing effect was. The system seemed incomplete without her daily contributions. The practices that had been helpful before started to feel taxing. The unspoken norms no longer applied. But rather than closing that gap, others wondered why suddenly things seemed more difficult. Christine's departure presented a question that nobody wanted to ask. If one departure causes such disruption, what has been in that person's suitcase all along? The answer was not very flattering. Christine had been actively involved with the family dynamic. She had been keeping it. Her need to compromise had prevented disputes from arising. Her patience has led people not to confront unpleasant truths. Her silence had maintained the illusion of a balance. The illusion disappeared once the silence was broken. The responses that came after were revealing. There was a degree of confusion. There was defensiveness. Even an attempt was made to spin the situation as a problem of communication, rather than a historical problem of balance. However, Christine was no longer playing that script. She wasn't interested in relitigating the past. She wasn't interested in assigning blame. She'd already passed the point of debate.
It has been established that the bug that people struggled with, though, wasn't the choice she made. It was her calmness. She didn't react emotionally as they had anticipated. She wasn't angry enough to be dismissed. Meanwhile, Mary's. She wasn't reactive enough to be controlled. She remained calm. Calmness can be a threat when it manifests as a lack of interest. Christine had emotionally displaced before she physically left. That's what gave her clarity. She had already mourned the relationship even as she remained within it. She had already dealt with the disappointment. She had already accepted the reality. By the time she walked away, she wasn't running from pain. She was moving out of it. That's why her leaving seemed so conclusive. There was no implication that she might return if things changed. No sense that this is a mere interlude. Christine had come to a conclusion, not a breaking point. This is significant. Breaking points are explosive. Conclusions are silent. The calmness of Christine revealed that this wasn't a matter of repairing anymore. It was a matter of ending something that could no longer be maintained. The family had to face a reality that it had been avoiding. That Christine has been miserable for a long time. That her needs had been demoted all along. That her loyalty had been assumed, not appreciated. And assumptions don't work when they are tested. The lack of Christine brought with it an element of reflection, even when that reflection might be painful. It revealed how she had invested her own emotional energies. How often her needs had been secondary. How often she had been expected to fall in with no complaints. This wasn't about one argument or one decision. It had to do with a process that had been taking place for far too long. The name that Christine had identified for that particular pattern. And once given a name, it cannot be ignored. Her choice also impacted how people perceived her. She was no longer the complying wife who was trying to make it work. She was a woman who had opted for clarity rather than endurance. This has really been a shift that has... People saw themselves in her story. In the years of compromise. In the hope that things would eventually improve. In the moment when they realized they are the only ones who are keeping the relationship together. Christine wasn't dramatic about that revelation. She didn't need to. The truth was strong.
The aftermath of what happened when Christine stepped away is not as loud as what most people might have been expecting. It failed in such a way that there was nothing remarkable happened. No instance where she seemed unsure or troubled. It is even more revealing to see that rather than a drastic change, relief. The changes that Christine's energy underwent didn't require explanation. She didn't walk the way she spoke with greater ease. She smiled without having to force it. It wasn't acting happiness. It was a lack of tension. For the first time in a long while, Christine wasn't dealing with someone else's feelings. She wasn't expecting reactions. She wasn't adapting to a space that had forced her to compact herself. This freedom was evident, and it reinforced all that came before it. Because when there is a chance that the person might look lighter when they leave, there is a question that arises. What were they carrying while they stayed? Her post-departure clarity wasn't about proving a point to others. It had to do with honoring herself. She didn't take the time to justify why she made her choice. There was no need for her to go into details. She didn't seek validation. She trusted the conclusion that she had already come to. This trust was a new development. For a long time, Christine had questioned herself. She had been second-guessing her own needs. She had been keeping her pain to a minimum in order to keep the peace. Now she wasn't doing that anymore. She let herself recognize what had been lacking, but didn't need to define it as failure. It had a profound impact on my perspective. Christine didn't leave because she stopped caring. She left because she cared enough to stop abandoning herself. That is a distinction that has. Her path post-exit wasn't one of revenge or comparison. It is a matter of rebuilding a sense of self that has been gradually destroyed. She gradually started making decisions that didn't consider how they would impact the people around her. She allowed joy to enter her life with no accompanying sense of guilt. She loved the concept of her happiness not needing an endorsement. This wasn't a rejection of family. It was a reclaiming of identity. There is a calmness to Christine's departure that unsettled people for a different reason. It challenged the story that leaving has to be a painful or regretful experience, that it is a struggle to choose yourself. Christine has proven that peace can come from honesty, and that peace made it even harder to say that she made a mistake. She wasn't apart, she was stabilizing. This served to highlight a certain discomfort. It had been costing her far more to stay than it would to leave.
Christine's change also impacted perceptions of others. Having her presence as a buffer against all the emotional fallout has been a significant factor. Conversations seemed more direct. Tensions were not so easily smoothed. Christine had been receiving the emotional impact that others had missed. It's been obvious that she has been making a difference when she stopped. Her presence had been masking the amount of emotional labor she was putting in, and invisible emotional labor is commonly undervalued. Christine's choice brought about a reassessment of what might constitute strength. Strength had long been considered a synonym for endurance. As staying. As is used. It has been redefined by. Strength, she showed, can also mean leaving with a sense of clarity, such as the choice of peace over persistence, such as valuing yourself enough to walk away. This has been a particularly cold autumn. They saw themselves in what she experienced. The era of putting extra effort, the hope that things would change, the point when they understood they were the only ones who were keeping the relationship together. Christine did not sensationalize that epiphany. She lived it. Her calm demeanor after she left said more than any explanation could. She didn't appear defensive. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't looking back. She was moving on. It wasn't hurried to go forward. It wasn't reactive. It was consistent. B. Christine wasn't trying to escape from the past. She had already made peace with it. This peace enabled her to construct something fresh with no resentment. She recognized what happened but didn't let that define what she wanted for the future. By recognizing what happened, this, mind you, wasn't rewriting history. It was a matter of learning from it. Christine's case defied a long-held tradition, so it means being there come what may. This is always a righteous act, which is a failure. Christine has proven that when there is a lack of reciprocity within loyalty, this sacrifice, when unseen, leads to erasure. And sometimes the best way to leave is to take a leap of faith. It is her acceptance of this truth that has made her story so compelling. She didn't need understanding. She showed how. By living differently. By speaking with confidence, not defensively. By choosing peace, no apologies necessary. Christine's life after she left didn't require explanation. It was the reason. And with her new reality emerging, she realized that her choice had impacted more than her own life. It had altered the way the entire story would be remembered. Now, because her statements weren't merely an explanation of why she left, they were of what she finally let herself have. These two sentences are similar in that they are comparisons, and from that came the foundation for the ultimate comprehension of how what Christine said meant so much because, when the dust finally settled, one thing became clear. Christine Brown wasn't just closing a chapter. She had changed the meaning of the whole story. What Christine finally said wasn't surprising because it was dramatic, because it was shocking. It was honest. She named something that people are often afraid to admit, that love is not enough when respect is missing, that cannot be maintained by one side alone, and that not speaking out doesn't preserve relationships. It slowly dissolves the person doing the silencing. Christine accused nobody of anything. By stepping out of the system, she exposed one. Her words had significant weight since they were not tinged with anger. They were fueled by acceptance. Acceptance that the kind of family she wanted wasn't the one she was living in. Acceptance of the fact that waiting longer would not have made any difference. Acceptance of the fact that choosing herself wasn't a betrayal. That acceptance sealed her honesty, and absolute truths are hard to question. Christine's story was relatable because she showed something quintessentially human. The moment when you realize that you've been trying harder than everyone else. The instant you finally know love shouldn't have to be about erasing herself all the time. That moment when it clicks in your brain that my well-being does matter. She gave voice to an experience so common yet difficult to put in words. Christine said what everyone was afraid of, but she did not destroy the family narrative. She made it clear. She demonstrated that harmony based on silence is easily broken. That is peace sustained by one person's emotional labor, which is unsustainable. And that's where fairness comes in, even for relationships based on tradition. Christine's calm delivery made it impossible to dismiss her truth as impulsive or emotional. She wasn't responding. She was finishing up. That distinction reshaped how her decision was understood. This was not a question of walking away from the responsibility. It was about not carrying it alone any longer. Christine's leaving necessitated a readjustment of the perception of strength. Strength wasn't staying at all costs. Strength was knowing when the price had become too high. She never asked anybody to follow her. She didn't seek justification for it. She didn't rewrite history in order to vindicate herself. She followed her instincts, and that trust gave her peace. She didn't just say it in the end, what everyone was afraid of. She lived it. She proved that choosing yourself doesn't mean you didn't love deeply. It means you loved honestly. And that changed everything because of the honesty. Not because it was loud, but because it was true.